Hello everybody. So today we're going to talk about the second major dispute within the Christian community in the aftermath of the Reformation. The first big dispute was actually in 1529. This was 12 years after Luther actually put up the 95 Theses, where he was objecting to indulgences and the church making money on the basis of indulgence and all that type of thing. And 12 years later he actually had a major dispute with a theologian from Switzerland called Zwingli, and his idea was that Zwingli's idea was that the actual Eucharist was only a symbol, and Luther didn't go along with that because he was more aware of the Christian tradition going right back to Augustine, and beyond that actually the church fathers all agreed with the Eucharist. But actually 40 years later, 50 years later, another great theologian named Arminius was born. He was born in 1560. He died in 1609. He lived the same length as Thomas Aquinas. Actually, they both died at 49 years of age. But Arminius had a sort of a clash with the whole idea of the theology of Calvin. And just to give a sort of a brief summary of this, it's all to do with God's grace and God's power and that sort of thing. But basically, back at the 4th century, the great theologian called Pelagius actually promoted the idea that a person can be saved through their own choices, their own free will, and that people are born neutral, and it's up to themselves basically to decide whether to do good or bad. And Augustine had a great clash with him back at that time, and Augustine put tremendous emphasis on the idea of God's grace being absolutely essential for salvation, and of course the Catholic Church has always agreed with that. And Martin Luther then in 1525, in the heat of the Reformation, wrote a book in response to another theologian called Erasmus. And the book Erasmus wrote actually was a book called On Free Will, which was actually highlighting the role of free will in terms of salvation, that Christ died for everyone would be the argument that Erasmus put forward, but that we need to cooperate with the will of God as expressed through the commandments, etc. So that's the human role, but that's the human part of it. However, Luther interpreted Augustine's writings very much, it's the latter writings of Augustine that he had access to in particular. And when Augustine was actually in conflict with Pelagius in relation to this whole controversy. And basically Luther, to a certain extent, exaggerated Augustine's writings, and he developed an idea called, the name of the book actually, like a lot of Luther's books, a lot of the contents of the books is actually contained in the title. And in this case, the book is called The Bondage of the Will. What he means by that is that the human will is bound towards sin, is totally inclined towards sin. We're all born that way and that type of thing. And therefore Luther actually promoted the idea in The Bondage of the Will that people play no part in their own salvation, that free will stands for nothing, that it's entirely 100% the work of Christ, and that it's 0% the work of mankind. This is different to the actual Catholic Church. The Catholic Church actually teaches the idea of the absolute requirement of the salvation of Jesus Christ, but also the requirement of human cooperation with that grace that's freely given. So here's where Luther and the Catholic Church run into sort of loggerheads with each other. Well, actually Luther tries to develop this theory of the bondage of the will, but at Trent, of course, the Catholic Church rejects both the bondage of the will and also rejects the idea of faith alone. So this guy within the Calvinist community, he's a Dutchman. His name is Joseph Arminius, and he's a great theologian as well, but he actually studies Calvin's writings, and Calvin develops Luther's ideas in terms of the bondage of the will, total depravity and all that. Calvin develops the idea of predestination or double destination, and where that comes from is, to a certain extent, it's a logical conclusion of the idea that human beings have nothing to do with their own salvation, which is a mistake that Luther made. Calvin, rather than seeing the actual flaw in Luther's thinking, he actually sort of carries it to its logical conclusion. And what he does in that is he regards Calvin as a lawyer, and he was trained as a legal mind all during his youth. So he tends to think in legal terms and logical terms, and he develops Luther's theology further. He thinks of God as the judge, he thinks of mankind as the guilty party in court, and he thinks of Jesus Christ in terms of the person that comes in and pays the fine. And therefore, Calvin develops the idea of that people play no role in their own salvation, and that in turn leads on to the logical conclusion that if they play no role in their own salvation, they're actually condemned before they're born, or they're saved before they're born. And all these theories like once saved, always saved, springs from this concept of total depravity that was developed by Luther in the Bondage of the Will in the mid-20s. I think it was actually 1525 that he actually wrote that book. And Calvin, of course, developed that further. And this other guy then, Arminius, he actually studied Calvinism in great detail, and he found that he actually was promoting the idea that if God has people born and predestined to be damned, this actually contradicts the whole concept of the mercy of God. So Luther develops this idea of the bondage of the will. Calvin carries it further in terms of predestination and total depravity and limited atonement and all those ideas. And Arminius is not happy with this because he recognizes that these ideas basically contradict two ideas actually. One, the mercy of God, and secondly, the idea of mankind's free will. And common sense would almost tell anyone that the idea that humanity has no free will, either in salvation or anything else, is a bit extreme, to put it mildly. And that's why, of course, Luther actually downgraded certain books in the Bible, especially the book of Wisdom, because it's full of moral theology, and, of course, the book of Sirach as well, which is based on the whole idea of, it's a repeat of the commandments in a whole range of different ways. And it's basically telling people to make proper choices throughout their life. There'd be no point in actually advice to make proper choices if everything was decided millions of years before you were born, as Calvin was suggesting. And of course, Joseph Arminius actually recognized that Calvin had taken this whole idea to an extreme, and he pushed back against that. And he developed a separate actual theology in regard to God's grace, which is actually really a repeat of what the Catholic Church stands for. But Arminius actually wasn't a Catholic by any means. He accepted all the other sort of doctrines, that there should only be two sacraments, that the Eucharist was only a symbol, and all those other, that there's no need for confession. He actually belonged to the Reformed faith. But in this regard, in regard to God's grace, he was basically a Catholic, and he ran into serious conflict with, actually Arminius himself, he died in 1609. But his followers and people who had studied his writings actually recognized that there was a lot of truth in what he had to say, that actually the whole idea that people are condemned to hell before they're born was a daft idea. So Arminius actually promotes this idea of God's mercy, and of course this is actually far too Catholic, and talking about God's mercy and prayers for the dead and all this sort of thing, far too Catholic for the Calvinist mentality at that time. So there's a major conflict actually, and in the year 1619, this is about 10 years after Arminius is actually dead. He died relatively young man, 49 years of age, tuberculosis. He done an awful lot to help the poor. He was undoubtedly a really good Christian. I looked at his life there a few days ago, a mini biography of what he done, and he was a very good-natured guy, a very intelligent guy as well, a great theologian. But he developed this ideology within the actual Reformed community, which is basically Catholic in terms of God's grace and God's power and God's sovereignty. So he didn't go along with the Calvin idea of Calvinism is basically the idea like that God's sovereignty is everything, that God's power is everything, but they actually overemphasize that to the point where actually they minimize too great an extent God's mercy. They also minimize the role of free will in salvation. So Arminius actually rejected that idea, and his followers, of course, were creating quite a stir, quite a conflict within the Calvinist community, and the actual Reformed Church, the Calvinist community, called a Synod in the year 1618, 1619, and the net effect of this Synod was actually to clearly define Calvinism, which is, it's actually can be summarized, or the acronym in relation to it is the word TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, and what that stands for is T stands for total depravity, which is the foundation stone of the whole lot. The other actual four words are basically just sort of confirming the idea of total depravity, which is of course probably a monumental mistake in itself, because Jesus Christ never talked about total depravity, and none of the apostles did either. It's a concept that's thought up around by Luther in the 1525 period, in this total bondage of the will. The total depravity idea is just other words to express the same idea. So the word TULIP actually defines Calvinism. It's to do with total depravity and all the other things that go along with that. Once saved, always saved, and all that. I hope to deal with that in a week's time. If you'd like to subscribe, I'll go through that in a bit more detail, the actual precise meaning of TULIP and what Calvinism is about, and why actually it became a strong religion in Europe, because it had the force of the state behind it, especially in Calvinist cities. The city councils and the actual governments of various countries enforced Calvinism, and it was a very strong doctrine. In actual fact, in the aftermath of the Synod of Dort, 200 of the ministers of the actual Arminian tradition found themselves without jobs. A lot of them had to leave the city, a lot of them were persecuted, etc. But it was basically a Catholic doctrine, what Arminian was promoting in regard to God's grace, that God's grace is absolutely essential for salvation, but also human cooperation is required. This is very much a central doctrine of the Catholic Church, going right back to the time of Augustine. And of course, Arminians sort of rediscovered that and basically contradicted Calvin and in relation to this, and as a result was expelled, or his people, his followers, were expelled from the movement. This is the second major division within the actual Christian community that were attempting to reform the church in the aftermath of the Reformation. This is almost 100 years on or it is 100 years on actually, from the time that Martin Luther originally put up the 95 Thesis. So I hope to develop these points in relation to TULIP idea and give a bit more detail on Calvinism next week, and have a look at how it got on in relation to its development in America relative to Arminianism, etc. So thank you very much for watching today, and this is Enda Benson, and goodbye for now.